Welcome to the first session of the Canadian Herpetological Society December Virtual Conference. My name is Pamela Rutherford and I'm the chair of the Meetings and Workshop Committee. Our first session will be moderated by Jonathan Choquette.
Hello everybody, I'm Jonathan Choquette. I'm a lead biologist with Wildlife Preservation Canada. I'm also a part-time PhD student at Laurentian University, and I'm connecting with you today from Windsor, Ontario. Can you hear me okay, Pam? Perfect. So I'm going to be your session chair for session 1 today. And that's the topic of our session is reptile behavior and conservation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presentation. And this will be by Doctors Julia Riley and James Baxter-Gilbert, and they will talk to us about AFROMONTANE crag lizards today. So welcome.
Hi, everyone. Today I want to tell you a quick story of following up on old natural history anecdotes of reptile social behavior on South African mountain tops. In South Africa, I have been studying the diversity of sociality expressed within the lizard family Cordalidae, which are also known as the girdled lizards. At first, my work focused on describing the social systems of species we already knew live in stable groups year-round, like the ones you can see on this slide. But then I also wanted to expand our understanding of the sociality of less studied cordalid species. So I delved into the literature, searching out any anecdotes of social behavior in this group. I came across this paper from 1962 by Don Broadley describing crag lizards as living in colonies. Crag lizards are typically under studied genus in the Cordalidae because they live in high elevation mountain ranges that can be difficult to access. Specifically, this paper that I found, as well as other anecdotes, mentioned that DRAKENSBERG crag lizards are found in small groups, and Lang's crag lizards are found in colonies, although no other details or definitions of these terms were provided. So myself and my collaborators set out to collect more information about the nature of these species' sociality. First, we aimed to quantify whether and to what degree these species aggregate. In particular, we noted aspects like group composition and if lizards were sharing a shelter site in order to compare their behavior to that of known group and family living lizards. Second, we aimed to study the degree to which these species were sexually dimorphic. This trait can give insights into a species' social and mating system. Known family and group living lizards, as well as those with monogamous mating systems, typically occur in sexually monomorphic species because there is less sexual conflict. So James and I set out to the Maloti-Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa. The majority of our work was focused along the Sentinel Peak hiking trail, but we were also able to observe lizards on the Pofung Plateau and along Organ Pipes Pass, where we actually followed the same pathway that Don Broadley did in that 1962 paper. We observed crag lizards along a transect, recording each lizard that we saw and whether or not they were grouping with conspecifics. We defined lizards to be within a group when they were within 3 meters of one another and within the visual line of sight of a conspecific or in physical contact with a conspecific. This definition was based off of our other observations of cordillid lizards that are gregarious and how they exhibit social tolerance. And we also caught lizards to measure their morphology and bite force. Here you can see a map with the location slightly blurred of the transects with our sightings of lizards represented here by orange dots for the Drakensberg crag lizard. The darker shaded points reflect that that lizard was observed in a group. And then that small inset box is the area in which we observed Lang's crag lizards, which are restricted to the higher elevations of our transect. Overall, both of these lizards were not that gregarious. 90% of Drakensberg crag lizards and 79% of Lang's crag lizards were observed alone. Of the groups that we did observe, their size was small, and the majority were not associated with the shelter. Interestingly, we never observed males grouping together. Group demographics were either males and females or adults with juveniles. We did find sexual dimorphism in both species. These are photos of the ventral side of male and female Drakensberg crag lizards. Males of both species were larger, had larger head than females of a similar body size, and were more colorful. Also, males bit harder than females. So the combination of these two clues, a lack of social aggregation and the presence of sexual dimorphism, has led us to hypothesize that these CRAG lizards have a territorial social system and a polygynous mating system. Similar systems have been described in the Australian water dragons that are shown on the left, and in Achrabi's flat lizards pictured on the right. Of course, this is a hypothesis that we have formed from a collection of novel natural history information. Much more research is needed to test this hypothesis more thoroughly. For example, our study doesn't discount the possibility that these lizards could be group living under a different set of circumstances. Repeated observations of their social behavior at more sites and over the seasons are needed to gain a better understanding of whether this species varies in their sociality. Also, experiments in either the field or the lab could help tease apart if these species are indeed territorial, as well as if their sociality has the capacity to vary depending on available shelter sites or other resources. I certainly hope to see more research on this system in the future, as well as reptile sociality in general. Thank you so much to my funding sources and my collaborators on this project, and also thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Hi everyone, I'm excited to present some results today looking at how habitat loss, roads, and their interaction affect reptile occupancy using data collected as part of a community science project. Before I begin, I want to thank my great collaborators on this project, including Tanya, Pulfer, Smera, Sukumar, Emma Horrigan, Ryan Zimmerling, and Christina Davy. We know that two of the largest threats to reptiles in Canada are the loss of habitat from expanding agricultural and urban areas, and road mortality as animals are hit by vehicles as they attempt to cross roads. We also know that threats can act synergistically, where the total effect they have on a population is greater than the sum of their individual parts. So we predicted that species occupancy probability would be negatively affected by habitat loss, and that road density would amplify that negative effect in a synergistic way. And so our objectives were to test how habitat loss, road density, and their interaction together affect reptile occupancy, and to use our results to be able to identify new locations for reptile populations. We used all reptile observations from the Ontario Reptile Amphibian Atlas between 2009 and 2018, which were divided between 1,622 10 by 10 kilometer sites. We analyze our data using occupancy models, which can incorporate differences between the sites in both search effort and landscape variables in order to estimate detection probability, that's the chance of finding a species if it's present, and occupancy probability, that's the chance of a species being present at a site. We use the results to be able to predict relationships between occupancy probability and habitat variables, but also to predict where species are likely to occur. Our first key result is that habitat loss negatively affected occupancy in 18 of the 22 reptile species we modeled, where the probability of a species occurring at a site decreased as the amount of habitat loss increases. For example, here are the model predictions for Blanding's turtle on the left and eastern hognose snake on the right for how each species responded to habitat loss. Surprisingly, road density affected occupancy in only a few species. There was evidence that eastern foxsnake was negatively affected by roads. Snapping turtle was positively affected by roads, but this species occurred at 97 of the 100 sites with the most roads. Gray rat snake and red-bellied snake are also in this category, but I've put a star beside them because they also had significant interaction terms. Now, I want to emphasize that roads are still a threat to reptiles, but that our results indicate that road density was not a strong predictor of whether a species occurs at a site. Now, did we see evidence that roads amplify the negative effect of habitat loss? There was a significant interaction term between habitat loss and road density in 4 species: gray rat snake, milk snake, red-bellied snake, and spotted turtle. As a reminder, the predicted synergistic effect we were looking for is that road density would amplify the negative effect of habitat loss, as shown on the right panel of this graph. However, when we look at the predictions for our models of those 4 species, we can see that for a wide range of road densities, the confidence intervals of how occupancy probability changes with habitat loss all overlap. So this suggests although the interaction term was different than 0, the model average predictions show that that effect was weak for all 4 species. To summarize our results, we found that habitat loss was a strong predictor of where reptile species occur. Road density was not a strong predictor of where species occur. And road density did not amplify the negative effect of habitat loss. In other words, we did not find evidence of a synergistic effect between these threats. One of the ways we can use our results are to identify places where species are likely to occur. In this map, I'm showing the predicted and confirmed occupancy for Blanding's turtles. You can see that, for example, the cluster of yellow squares in eastern Ontario would be a good place to survey for new populations of this species. Before I end, I just want to thank all the community scientists that have submitted observations to the Ontario Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, and I look forward to answering any questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Winton, and I work on species conservation planning with Wildlife Preservation Canada. Today I'm going to talk about the Canadian Species Initiative, a new program launched last year in partnership with African Lion Safari. Given the extensive impact of human activities on wild populations, and with new challenges such as diseases and climate change emerging, there's an increasing need for species conservation to include active management and long-term human intervention in recovery efforts. There are many ways that hands-on ex situ activities can directly address the threats a species is facing. Examples include targeted research on disease, head-starting juveniles to boost survival in the wild, or assurance populations for reintroduction. Hannah McCurdy-Adams' presentation on the MASSASAUGA species survival plan gets more in-depth on an example of this, so please check that out as well. There are also indirect conservation roles such as education and funding, and one ex situ program may serve several conservation roles. So while there is a recognized role for ex situ management in species conservation, zoos unfortunately are not meeting this increasing need. Here we see that IUCN red-listed vertebrate species only make up a small proportion of zoo collections, indicating that zoos are not prioritizing species at risk. We found a similar pattern in a preliminary assessment of Canadian zoos and species. So there's a definite gap when it comes to zoos meeting conservation needs. Part of the problem is that species conservation planning has traditionally followed 2 parallel but separate tracks. In situ wildlife managers and field biologists work independently from ex situ zoo and aquarium managers to develop conservation plans for their respective populations. Furthermore, there's often a lack of acknowledgement or even consideration by the in situ community of the possible roles zoos and aquariums can have in species conservation. And conversely, zoos and aquariums are not always aware of existing in situ recovery efforts and priorities. The IUCN Conservation Planning Specialist Group supports the joint development of management strategies and conservation actions by all responsible parties. This is called the One Plan approach. The One Plan approach allows consideration of all available and effective management options and acknowledges that when used strategically, ex situ methods can be a key tool for species conservation that complement field-based conservation efforts. Through integrated workshop processes, in situ and ex situ communities are brought together to develop recommendations for ex situ activities based upon species conservation needs and practical constraints. The recommendations from this process inform collection plans and also ensure that ex situ activities ultimately serve the conservation of wild populations. Full participation by all stakeholders from the planning stages onwards is critical to the success of the process. Wildlife Preservation Canada and African Lion Safari recognize the need for integrated conservation planning in Canada and joined to launch the Canadian Species Initiative in 2019. Specifically, CSI strives to ensure due consideration of ex situ tools in recovery planning through the application of IUCN workshop processes and works with partners to develop and implement integrated conservation plans for species requiring ex situ management. CSI also serves as the Regional Resource Center in Canada for the IUCN Conservation Planning Specialist Group and brings effective species conservation planning tools and approaches to projects. Wildlife Preservation Canada's Conservation Action Plan identifies species for which some form of ex situ management has been recommended in recovery documents or by species experts. Here's a snapshot of Canadian herb species on our list. Species in green are ones we know of that have some form of ex situ project underway, but the list is still long and almost half the species in need have no active ex situ efforts. So while we have a good idea of the species for which Canadian zoos and aquariums are most urgently needed as conservation partners, integrated collection assessment and planning remains a gap in our efforts to conserve native biodiversity in Canada. CSI has been working to engage relevant stakeholders for our inaugural workshop in early 2021, focused on Canada's snake species. More than 60% of Canadian snakes are at some level of risk, and there is great opportunity to advance snake conservation in Canada through this process. If you are interested in opportunities to assist with planning or participating in the workshop, or to discuss the One Plan approach process for other species or taxonomic groups, please reach out to us. And if you'd like to learn more about the conservation planning process, check out the recording of our Herp Hangout presentation available on the CHS YouTube channel. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, I'm Hannah, and we're a group of collaborators working to drive rattlesnake conservation forward by first increasing the number of snakes in captivity. Endangered species conservation requires a variety of partners and the use of many methods to effectively recover species. Methods are generally separated into two broad categories: in situ or in place in the wild, and ex situ or out of place in an institution like a zoo. I'm focusing on one ex situ tool called Species Survival Plans, or SSPs. SSPs are created by associations of accredited zoos and aquariums to responsibly manage a captive population of a species generally in need of conservation actions, study the species biology and improve captive care, provide outreach and education capacity, and contribute animals for reintroduction or augmentation of the wild populations. The status of the eastern Massasauga varies somewhat, but depending on the agency or government determining the status and the spatial scale, but generally, the most up-to-date status ranks of the eastern Massasauga are that they are threatened across their entire range and that the southern Ontario populations are in need of active conservation management. To the Anishinaabe people, the Massasauga rattlesnake holds very special meaning and purpose as a medicinal, spiritual, and cosmic entity. As told by Sam Kwakwato, an elder and knowledge keeper of Shawanaga First Nation, shared by Roger Jacklin, an elder and knowledge keeper of Magnetawan First Nation, and the Union of Ontario Indians Anishinaabe Nation, the story of the Massasauga describes it as a plant protector and conservation measure to protect people from overharvesting berries and plants by buzzing its tail. There is a species survival plan for the eastern Massasauga. For over a decade, the Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake SSP has been collaborating with partners in the US to survey and collect informative natural history data on a stable and managed population of Eastern Massasaugas in Michigan. The SSP is currently genetically managed as one single global population rather than the separate units that Canada classifies the Eastern Massasauga into. The SSP is doing a fantastic job attaining its first three goals, but is currently too small to be viable long-term or for large-scale captive breeding to provide a sustainable source of snakes for conservation translocations or managed release to the populations most at risk in the wild. Our aim is to collect snakes across the entire Canadian geographical range of the Eastern Massasauga to improve the conservation potential of the SSP. This map shows the Canadian range enclosed within Ontario of the Eastern Massasauga, outlined in black, and the extent of the known recent populations in red. This past year, snakes were provided from one southern or Carolinian designatable unit population and a handful of northern or Great Lakes St. Lawrence designatable unit populations, and they're indicated by the yellow checkmark icons. We will be collecting snakes from other regions outlined in green in 2021. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence DU on the Bruce Peninsula and in eastern Georgian Bay is the largest and most stable global population of the Eastern Massasauga. A healthy SSP population will allow ex situ and in situ communities to work together for more effective conservation of the species. The new Canadian Species Initiative is actively working to facilitate collaboration between Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums members and other ex situ community members and the in situ community, and to integrate the IUCN's One Plan approach into species recovery planning in Canada. As Stephanie mentioned, we will be hosting our first integrated workshop early next year that will provide guidance on conservation priorities for collection planning for Canadian snake species like the eastern Massasauga to better integrate ex situ support with in situ conservation needs. I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators that helped us get to where we are now. Kelsey Jeff and the Small Army at Scales Nature Park. Anthony at the Land Between Community Nominated Priority Place, Josh and the whole Georgian Bay Cares crew, Jessica and Johnny with me at Wildlife Preservation Canada, Anne's team at 8 Trees Inc., Donnell and Rick at the Toronto Zoo, and Cory and Alanna at Magneto One First Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge all the landholders and managers that have and are still to give us permission to enter their lands and collect snakes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. All right, so that brings us to the end of all 4 planned presentations. So we're going to open it up to questions by anybody, and I guess I will be guiding this, looking at questions in the chat, but also anybody can feel free to open their mic up. And we have Julia, James, Stephanie, and Hannah who are available to answer any questions that you may have. And let's.
I have a question.
Sure, go Ann.
Okay. Hi, Hannah. What's the goal for the numbers for the SSP? I'm not familiar with the actual goal.
Johnny may actually be able to speak to this as well, but for now, the goal is to collect 50 snakes. And it was, I believe, determined by the people that manage the species survival plan. And so the genetic manager is someone that is at an institution in the States. But it took into consideration the number of snakes that are currently in the SSP and how much genetic diversity would help ensure that the captive population could not only be sustainable long-term, but also be big enough to provide animals for release into populations that need it. And so they've actually, the SSP has also agreed that Ojibwe is down in Windsor is the first population that needs the most help. And so that's the goal, is then get as much genetics from Carolinian DU as possible to be able to release snakes into Ojibwe first. And then of course, if it's a long-term captive population, then it could help other populations as they need it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I just wondered where Wainfleet fit into it, because we have only given a few, with 6 snakes last year, I think it was. And sometimes we have surplus for our forced hibernation, and sometimes we don't, but in 2019 we did. So I'm just wondering how that fits in. Is it opportunistically done?
Yeah, there's an element of opportunistic, an element of permit complications, and an element of people interested in being involved. I know we wanted as many Carolinian DU snakes as possible. We do have the permit now to save the last few snakes if we can find any in Windsor. And you actually provided a higher amount of snakes than our general guidelines for collecting snakes elsewhere. We're collecting less of them within a certain range. And so it's sort of another balance of getting as much geographical and genetic diversity as possible.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. There's a question here in the chat for Julia. I want to make sure everybody at least gets one question here. So this was from Nick Cairns. If you want to expand, let me know, but I'll just read your question here. It was, can you expand on the demographics of the groups you did see? That's for you, Julia.
Sure. So for the CRAG lizards, we largely saw adult males and females together, or an adult associating with juveniles. This is pretty typical for lizard associations. The adults could be breeding pairs, and also often females associate with their young post-birth. Again, this study was, we had different plans when we began this study. We had to kind of triage the methodology as we went, because we went in with the expectation that these lizards were more gregarious than they were. And basically those could also have included random associations, right? So non-preferred social associations. In other studies, with more extensive repeated sampling, you can actually tease apart what are random social associations from preferred social associations with things like social network analysis. So in my other work, I've done that, but with these lizards, we didn't, because it was a surprise how few were actually in groups. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Thank you for your answer. Geez, I clicked my mute button too many times. Okay, the next question we have for James, and there's a couple questions, but I'm going to do the first one first here. So, do you have any plans to validate your model predictions in coming years? James, that's for you.
Thanks. Good question, Dan. Nice to hear from you. Essentially, we don't have plans to validate in the same form that the data was collected, because the community science data has a very specific detection probability distribution, and the amount of effort is so large. We did validate the current models by using goodness of fit tests, where we simulate capture histories using the assumptions of the model we estimate. We can also divide, because there's a large volume of data, we can divide the data in parcels and then predict on, like, using a training set and then predicting on an unknown set to validate how well it works. So those are some of the ways that we basically tested that our models were correctly estimating something. But we're not going to go out and collect more data, because the Reptile Amphibian Atlas data collection is winding down and they're just moving on analysis now. Good question.
Thank you, James. Okay, before we go, there's some other questions for James, but I just want to give Stephanie a chance. Are there any specific questions for Stephanie about her talk? I have a question for you, Stephanie. With regard to the Canadian Species Initiative, but with Canadian snakes, like, specifically, what are the next steps there for that project?
Sorry, for the Canadian Snake Workshop?
Yeah.
Okay, well, right now we are working on identifying stakeholders and compiling species threat assessment and like natural history data, so we can create taxon data sheets that'll be prepared for the workshop. And then, yeah, our plan is to host this workshop hopefully at the end of February, I think is the plan. So anyone who works on snakes should keep their schedule open then. And yeah, we'll be reaching out to stakeholders soon. So you'll likely hear more about it.
I'm excited to join. Perfect. So we have a few more minutes. So I'm going to go through these additional questions that were aimed at James here. So this one's from David Seaburn. You said snappers appeared to be correlated with increased road density, but likely because they occurred in many sites, i.e. in many grid squares with high road density. Was this also true of painted turtles? And any idea why snappers persist even at such high road densities?
That's a good question. So the short version is that both painted turtles and snapping turtles are basically predicted to be at almost every grid square. If you look at the range maps for both those species, any square that has almost any search effort will have confirmed painted turtle and snapping turtle presence. And the model basically, even though it said the relationship was positive with road density for snapping turtles, you can imagine the intercept is almost close to 100% where every site is occupied. Painted turtles had a similar pattern. And then in terms of why they persist at these sites, remember that occupancy just depends on at least one individual being present. So there could still be a negative effect on the population, and it might be like basically an extinction debt where eventually those populations are going to blink out. But because they're still present, the sites are still occupied.
Okay, thanks, James, and thanks to the rest of our speakers for your great presentations and for answering our questions.